Bonjour tout le monde, and welcome back to the third and final part of my Fire Emblem Three Houses 100% completion tier list. Definitely check out the links to the first two parts in the description if you haven't watched those yet, because I'll be jumping right back into the tiering today. Now that the students of the game's titular houses are out of the way, it's time to dig into the rest of the playable cast, the characters affiliated with the Church of Seiros, along with the 6 characters added to the game via updates or DLC. Seiros starts that group off very strong. He's got a fantastic set of boons, including a much appreciated one in flying, and the one bane he's got doesn't matter all that much. Combine that obvious physical prowess with surprisingly workable magic parameters and that authority for quicker adjutant flexibility, and Seiros comes off looking like a top-tier unit for sure. Unfortunately, that's not the whole story here, because Seiros doesn't join your army until Chapter 12, just about at the game's halfway point. That's a substantial availability deficit compared to most of the students, and as a result, I've got no choice but to put him in C tier below Hilda. One important thing to note with Seiros, though, is that his Silver Snow availability comes with a unique and very helpful quirk, in the form of him being force deployed in Chapter 13 in the place of your now missing House Leader. Non-Crimson Flower Chapter 13 is the infamous Hunting by Daybreak map, where your available units and their starting locations are severely restricted. Seiros taking the place of Dimitri or Claude on this map in Silver Snow is a significant advantage for him, to the point that I suggest doing all of his active runs on that route so as to give him the most playtime. Silver Snow may be a fairly lackluster route for 100%. It's a chapter shorter than Azure Moon and Verdant Wind, and the only exclusive content it has on offer is Rhea's S ranks, but as you'll have to run it a handful of times, you should plan to enjoy all the benefits it does have when you do. Now on to Seiros' younger female relative. Does anyone really care about story spoilers in a 100% tier list? Whatever. Flame comes in at Chapter 7, which is rather an awkward time for her as it's past the early game, but still a chapter before the first knowledge gem becomes available and allows later arrivals to catch up faster. That, in combination with her initial squishiness, is what gives Flame the impression of being underleveled, even when she follows the same auto-leveling mechanic as every other character. Her skill ranks don't help her much with getting off the ground faster either, as they're typical for a caster who doesn't have much else to offer once she's done with her magic ranks. She does get Frozen Lance out of her Lance boon, although she has to wait all the way until A rank for it after the point where it would be of any real use to her. She shares Seiros' tolerable Riding Bane, but pairs it with a less tolerable one in heavy armor. Technically speaking, she has a similar advantage to Edelgard and Hubert, in that while she leaves your party should you go Crimson Flower, she can still be trained up in the classroom before that point. There's really not much you can do with classroom training in just 5 chapters though, so for all practical purposes, Flame is still unavailable for those runs. She's going between Hilda and Seiros, to match her availability and her lack of any other really strong characteristics that would justify placing her elsewhere. Next are the Officers' Academy's 2 teachers. Hanneman and Manuela both join you in Chapter 8, which is a pretty good time to be a late joiner since it's when the first knowledge gem becomes available. How do they stack up against the rest of the cast, and each other? Looking at Hanneman, what first stands out are his movement type skills. A riding boon barely matters in the best of situations, but when paired with Banes in both heavy armor and flying, it just comes off like terrible optimization. Hanneman performs very well as a mage, naturally, with Thoron, Ragnarok, and Meteor, and even a perfectly usable Faith list. But when it comes to physical classes, he's really going to struggle to distinguish himself. Given how much time he'll be stuck in Great Knight and Wyvern Lord grinding out their movement skills, that's not a good sign for his tier placement. He's got the boon in bows, so he's a little like Hubert, who trades being root locked for missing out on early game instead. On that note, it is worth mentioning that unlike Seiros and Flame, Hanneman and Manuela are both available in Crimson Flower, but you shouldn't bother with using them as anything but classroom units in that route. Crimson Flower is already too short for its own good, so why make that into even more of a hurdle by using characters who join later on when you don't have to? Hanneman lands right between Flame and Seiros on the tier list. The 4 extra chapters of availability over the latter is a really big deal in spite of everything else. And while he and Manuela may come in at a more convenient chapter than Flame, their drawbacks are noticeably worse than hers. This brings me to Manuela, another one of those characters who doesn't rate all that highly in the estimation of most serious players. To some extent, they've got a point. Manuela seems designed as an attempt at a jack-of-all-trades unit, and in the process she doesn't succeed all that well at anything. She's got balanced offensive growths and no physical banes, but her only boon in that area is in the weapon type that matters least. Her magic situation is just bizarre, too, between her Reason Bane and her wildly inconsistent spell lists that cap off with the incredible duo of Warp and Bolting, but are almost complete duds otherwise. All the same, though, for the purposes of 100%, I do think she narrowly edges out Hanneman. They share that bothersome heavy armor Bane, but a Bane in Reason is far less of an issue than one in Flying, and Hanneman having the more valuable weapon boon is balanced out by Manuela having the more useful one in Magic. She's also not quite able to measure up to Flayn in her barely noticeable Riding Bane, but Manuela does win out over her fellow Professor and comic foil. Now, because the in-game roster order is weird sometimes, we return to D tier for another root-exclusive character. Gilbert has the misfortune of being not only root-locked, but also Part 2 locked, and when he's only got 10 chapters and 8 calendar months to his name, he's going to have to put in a real effort to max everything out. Gilbert does come with two notable advantages to help ease that process. The first being that he's locked to the second longest route in the game, and the second being his lack of Banes. As far as skill ranks go, he's essentially Ferdinand minus a sword boon he'll barely miss, which as you can tell based on Ferdinand's tier placement is high praise indeed. Gilbert's magical performance is admittedly pretty bad, and I'm not fond of him joining with only D+ in authority when both Seteth and Alois come in earlier with a higher base, but it is what it is. Honestly though, if Edelgard and Hubert didn't have Silver Snow classroom time to pad out their training, I'd be seriously considering rating Gilbert above them. A total lack of Banes and a comparatively much more generous root lock are really solid points in his favor. But sadly for him, they do get that classroom time, so it's below all the other D tiers for Gilbert. Coming back to my mention of Alois and his higher base authority, I'm sorry to say that high base ranks in specific areas is about all he has going for him. He's another axe and brawling guy in the vein of Caspar and Raphael, only he's also hobbled by a Flying Bane as well as coming along much later as what is essentially mid-game filler. His magic sucks, he'll be spending a long time in Wyvern Lord, you know how this goes by now. Alois is going beneath Seteth, because while he may have one extra chapter plus classroom training in Crimson Flower, that's not enough to make up for Seteth's all-around superior performance. High base ranks aren't all that remarkable when all of the late recruits have them, and they'll only take these characters so far when the goal is to max out all of their skills and classes, and not just the ones where they naturally excel. Catherine's a rather more interesting unit in a number of ways. Her availability resembles Hilda's in that she can be recruited in the early game in Azure Moon and Verdant Wind, but either comes too late or not at all in the Eagle's routes. She and her partner Shamir also come with the distinction of having the highest number of neutral skill ranks, hence her short list of boons and banes. There's a pattern to them too. Catherine and Shamir each have 2 weapon boons and a magic bane, with no overlap between them. Catherine's sword boon counts for as little as it usually does, and the Reason Bane is also not much worth noting, aside from making it harder for her to get into the only sword-focused masterclass. No, the rank that really stands out with Catherine is that Brawling boon, a very rare sight on a female character and quite the welcome one too, in combination with her high base rank in the skill. After some thought, I decided that, unorthodox though it may be, Catherine actually deserves to be above Hilda. As I said, their availability is similar, with Hilda only having at most 2 chapters and the mock battle over Catherine, and Catherine wins out with a boon even more valuable than Hilda's budding talent in heavy armor, not to mention a more tolerable magic bane and a neutral authority skill. You'd never use either character outside the classroom in Silver Snow, but it's not difficult to make the most of their time on the 2 routes where they're recruitable in the early game. Shamir, meanwhile, joins 2 chapters after Catherine at her best with an equally small list of boons and banes, and at first glance she comes off looking a bit worse in comparison. That boon and bows could never matter as much as one in Brawling, especially when Shamir's starting bow rank is just 3 levels away from S+, and Faith is the harder of the 2 magic banes to manage. Shamir does have a slight edge when it comes to magic overall, though, with a more diverse set of reason spells and physic for weak long-distance healing, but I wouldn't call that much of an advantage. What is an advantage for Shamir, however, is that she's not in love with Rhea the way that Catherine is, allowing her to be recruited in Chapter 6 regardless of route. I still wouldn't use her for Crimson Flower, but Shamir is fully viable in Silver Snow and can benefit from the normal amount of classroom time on both Eagles routes. Is that good enough to put her above Catherine and Hilda? I think so. Chapter 6 is still early enough in the game that Shamir can catch up to the student characters easily, and her single Bane is easier to handle when it's the only one she's got, and when her magical prospects aren't as bad as might be expected, provided you can work around her low magic growth. I'm inclined to agree with Maddening players that Shamir is something of a hidden gem among the church characters. In their case, it's because she'll master Sniper and unlock Hunter's Volley before anyone else, but for 100% it's because she has solid all-around availability for a non-student character and skill ranks that even out to just a bit above average. I'd rather a character with a bunch of neutral ranks than one with a lot of good boons offset by an equal number of crippling banes. That's sort of the case with Cyril here. Cyril is most easily compared to Petra, in that they share that concerning double magic bane, but in other respects Cyril is a little better off. He swaps a boon in swords for a slightly more useful one in lances, and while I can take or leave his extra riding boon, his flying boon is much more appreciated on him since, limited options for male flyers. Cyril also has his personal ability Aptitude helping him out in the growth department, making him 3 houses equivalent to the villager characters of Awakening and Fates, and stronger than he initially looks, even in magic, surprisingly enough. His spell lists are still dismal, but on the plus side, he's got point-blank volley for more flexible positioning as an archer, so there's that. Yeah, Cyril's performance is kind of all over the place, but it all works out to above average. What's not above average for Cyril, though, is his availability, which is as constrained as Catherine's. So where to put him? He's below Shamir, no question, and when Catherine's got an extra chapter, 1 fewer bane, and that incredible brawling boon on her, I think she's easily above Cyril as well. Hilda is a tougher argument all around, and while I think the two are very close, I'm going to give her the edge here. She's got more of early game available to her, and doesn't have to work to catch up to the rest of your units, and while her boons are fewer in number and weaker in quality, she also won't struggle quite as much with her banes. Cyril's the last of the characters in the base game, but there's 6 more who were added via updates or DLC, and... Alright, let's do this. Jeritza is the closest thing Three Houses has to a Gota character. Named for this guy from Shadow Dragon, Gota characters are strong pre-made units given to you near endgame. They're meant as emergency failsafes to prevent the player from being soft-locked, in the event that all of your characters got really terrible RNG with level-ups, or you got them all killed off. Other examples of Gota units include Athos from Blazing Blade, and the Laguz Royals from both Tellius games. The trouble here is that Gota characters are a poor fit for the design philosophy of Three Houses, which encourages the player to build most units from the ground up, and it's certainly at odds with the spirit of 100% completion as I've defined it here. Jeritza does indeed have the highest base ranks of any character in the game, including in some of his neutral skills, a unique class he doesn't have to certify for that can easily carry him to endgame, and he's got Mastermind as an equipable ability, allowing him to grow as fast as Lysithea if you feel like experimenting a little with him. That's just it, though. In normal play, the most you'll ever be able to deviate from Jeritza's pre-built parameters is minor experimentation, nothing like the cap-all skills and classes goal of 100%. That is, of course, because he's locked to Part 2 of Crimson Flower, giving you only 6 chapters and 4.5 calendar months to develop him in. How bad is that exactly? Let's crunch some numbers over a skill rank I often overlook, Authority. Jeritza starts with a B rank in Authority. To go from B to S plus requires 2,920 skill points. Thanks to his Authority Bane, Jeritza can gain at most 3 points in the skill in each combat encounter, or 6 if he uses a Gambit. Note that requires him to have both Mastermind and one of the 2 Knowledge Gems equipped, which given his extremely limited availability should always be the case. He doesn't have access to any Authority boosting classes. 2,920 divided by 3 rounded up equals 974. The total number of combat encounters or white magic uses he'll have to cap Authority. If you follow my 100% guide, I recommend doing 4 active runs for each unit, as the most efficient way to divide up the classes, and also allow for the optimal number of active units per run. 974 divided by 4 rounded up equals 244, meaning that many encounters in each run. But how many battles does Crimson Flower actually have? There's the 6 story maps, of course, but there's also a total of 16 free weekends, and assuming you're going into this with max professor level, and why wouldn't you, each of those weekends represents a chance for 3 battles. As you also take the first weekend of each month, apart from the first, to explore, to take care of journal purchases, restore your unit's motivation, use a sauna, and so forth. That leaves 12 free weekends for battling, which equals 42 total battles, including the story maps. 244 divided by 42 is about 6, and 6 encounters per map sounds quite doable, especially when gambits count double, and assuming your units other than Jeritza are on top of their own authority ranks and can be used in the backline to minimize the number of characters you have down on the field competing for kills. But that's a lot of allowances to make for just one character, to max a rank that every other character in the game can reasonably expect to be done within just 1 or 2 active runs. Him monopolizing a knowledge gem is equally bad, because that will leave Edelgard and Hubert to fight over the second one, while the other characters you brought along to Crimson Flower are just going to be out of luck and hoping they can make up that in runs of other routes. I didn't mention classroom time either, because Jeritza's got 10 other skills to level, and it's very likely he'll have to use his likewise limited lecture opportunities to push his other ranks up for class certification. He'll cap swords and lances and riding in no time at all thanks to boons and high base ranks, but his bows will take a while, his heavy armor will take a while, his flying will take a while, even with his budding talent. And let's not forget here that all those weekends taken up with battles you'll be struggling to keep Jeritza motivated for private instruction every week, which will slow him down getting his budding talent, just growing in general. His magical outlook is also awful, even before you account for his faith may make it even worse, and while I'd normally suggest training him as an adjutant to work around a small spell list, guess what? He can't do that, or there's no way he'll cap his authority in time. Oh! You have no idea how many times my voice went out doing that section, but I wanted to impress on you just how much of a headache Jeritza is. Hopefully now you can see what I mean about Crimson Flower being by far the worst route for 100%, because if Jeritza falls short in any area and can't max everything out in the time he's allotted, that just means you'll have to run Crimson Flower even more, and in so doing hurt every character who's not exclusive to the route. Unless you count Byleth, Jeritza is just about my least favorite character in 3 houses already, but contending with him in 100% completion makes me want to tear my hair out. He's E tier, all of E tier, because no other character in 3 houses will require as much attention and favoritism and special allowances to max him out. Anyone who claims that Edelgard favors meritocracy and not blatant cronyism should just point at this guy. I need a palate cleanser after that, so let's talk about Anna. Regarded as arguably the worst character in the game in standard play, you wouldn't think there's much to her. Anna's got the same problem as Manuela in that she's an underwhelming hybrid unit, with even the same Faith Boon and Reason Bane joined to bad spell lists capped off by fantastic finishers in Rescue and Meteor. Anna's got a few extra bits here and there, Petra's trio of weapon boons and Bernadetta's budding talent, but all in all there's not much to impress here. However, Anna's biggest selling point, pun intended, is her availability. She joins in Chapter 3 in all routes with no need for any support buying or level requirements, just that you bought the expansion pass. And really, Cindered Shadows and the Ashen Wolves are worth the price of admission alone there, in my opinion. Anna and everything else is just lanyap. With that in mind, Anna's an easy A tier, having just about the same availability as most of the student characters without the need to ever wrangle with cross-house recruitment. She's got one additional quirk too, one that from every other angle is rightfully regarded as a bad thing. Anna has no supports at all. Whether that's a sign of lazy development or the ever-shallow characterization of Fire Emblem's unofficial series-wide mascot, for 100% purposes it's just one less thing you'll have to worry about. I haven't talked about supports at all thus far, but filling out the support log is as much a part of 3 Houses 100% as it is for every Fire Emblem in which that feature appears. Having a character who can ignore supports completely is a nice perk, and it suits the low-effort tone of A tier perfectly well. My hottest take for the entire tier list will be that Anna deserves to be at the top of A tier, as the most low-maintenance character in the entire game, even including Byleth. Her performance may leave a lot to be desired, but it's normal mode, you know. That brings me at last to the Ashen Wolves, the real stars of the game's DLC. The Wolves, collectively, are much like Anna, being free early game recruits in every route provided you've unlocked them first in Cindered Shadows. The game may hardly bother to integrate them into the main story, but that easy availability does wonders for the Wolves' overall performance in 100%, and they all make it into A tier as a result. The question of whether the Wolves deserve to be above or below Anna is a bit of a difficult one. Not because they have Chapter 2 over her when your actions that chapter are railroaded by the game, but rather because each of them is unquestionably a better unit than Anna could ever hope to be. Still, that's not quite what I'm measuring with this list, and as Anna's net proficiency of 3 equals or surpasses each of the wolves, I'm inclined to place them all below her. Something all 5 characters have in common is that because they're recruited for free very early on in all routes, they'll frequently run into the odd issue of having too much classroom time. With Anna and the wolves, you'll sometimes have to ignore their growth in runs, lest they max out their skills too quickly and have nothing left to work on when it comes time for them to be active units. Growing too fast for your own good is admittedly a handy problem to have, and it places them all in the same minimal effort tier as Byleth is with their rapid faculty training growth. Not even Lysithea can claim as much, since Mastermind doesn't impact her classroom growth. The DLC characters don't warrant S tier like Byleth, because maxing out Anna and the wolves doesn't directly help any of the other units, but even so, I thought it worth explaining how the experience of using these 5 characters really does make you appreciate their incredible availability, and more than justifies their place as the top half of A tier. Now then, to see how the wolves all measure up to one another. Yuri's got a lot going on, as you can see. He and Balthus are the inverse of Catherine and Shamir, in the sense that they have the fewest neutral skill ranks in the cast. Of the two of them, Yuri is the more regrettably balanced, with a Bane for almost every one of his boons. They don't quite even out either. A budding talent in bows granting him Deadeye won't make up for a flying Bane, and a Lance and Axe Bane together is barely counterbalanced by boons and swords and the magic ranks. Yuri won't struggle much with his weak points thanks to the abundant playtime of all the wolves, but compared to the rest of them he will struggle a fair bit. He is quite good as a hybrid unit, and aside from Dark Knight and Holy Knight, he'll have no trouble making it in any of the magic classes, but quite a few of the dedicated physical classes will give him some trouble. Balthus has an excess of boons and banes as well, but his are less balanced in a way that's very much in his favor. He's the only character who can rival Claude for total number of boons, and while he suffers from a flying bane like too many other male characters, and doesn't appreciate the one in bows either, he does quite well for himself otherwise. While all the wolves are to some degree magically inclined, Balthus fares the worst of them there, with the lowest magic growth and the worst spell list. But he's still far better off than some of the other duds in the roster, and won't even have to worry about magic for very long with double magic boons. The surprisingly versatile King of Grappling handily tops Yuri. On the tier list, I mean. That's still an open question in more private arenas. Constance is, well, not constant, that is the joke. But fluctuating stats aside, she's got some very strong points. Strongest among them is that budding talent in brawling, but she can also go toe-to-toe in magic with Lysithea and can easily work around her bad strength with a combination of Soul Blade, Mystic Blow, and an Authority boon to get her to regular adjutant status in no time. The Heavy Armor Bane is a nuisance, but it's not enough to keep me from placing Constance above Balthus. He has more boons, but he's got more banes too, and the value of a female character who can get herself out of War Cleric faster than normal can't be understated. Now for the last character in the roster. Happy's got some interesting traits to be sure, although they're countered hard by her having the same weak net proficiency as Yuri and the dreaded Brawling and Heavy Armor Bane combo also seen on Bernadetta and Marianne. Those are indeed serious issues, and her otherwise passable physical performance is going to have serious gaps in quality as a result. Speaking of her physical performance, I've always had a theory about Happy's somewhat unusual skill ranks. All of the DLC classes are taken from Fire Emblem Awakening, but of the 4, the only one that didn't originate in the game is Happy's signature Valkyrie, which first appeared in either the Yggdrasil games or the GBA games, depending on how you're defining it. Awakening does, however, have a 4th standard class that Three Houses could have used for its DLC, that being the axe-wielding Griffin Rider. It would be interesting if at some point in development Happy had been intended to be a Griffin Rider, hence her random flying boon and even more random budding talent and axes. But at some point she was instead changed to be a dark mage with strange monster summoning powers. Food for thought, but it's not going to keep her from a place below the other wolves. Even compared to Yuri and his more numerous banes, Happy's are just quite the handful. And there we have it, the completed tier list. I think there's a couple of placements on here that might surprise some players in how much they differ from tier lists for standard gameplay. What do you think? As I've said, I doubt that most people would want to approach Three Houses like this, but if you're a more casual player, or even if you consider yourself a more serious one, I'd be interested to know if you got something useful out of this project. Is there anyone you think deserves to be placed somewhere else? I may be the only person I've ever seen talking about 100% completion of this game online, but even so, this tier list is my own opinion, and undoubtedly there are other methods that could be applied here than the one I've used. Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel if you enjoy my content. I'm going to be taking a short break from these big video projects for a few weeks, but when I'm not doing these, I do enjoy making those little podcast-style pieces on various topics, Fire Emblem and otherwise. Au revoir!